Okay, Russia after the 30 Years' War, or part 2 of our Unit 3.3, Absolutism in Eastern Europe lecture series. The development of the Russian and the Ottoman Empire. What were the distinctive features of Russian and Ottoman absolutism being our guiding question. A favorite parlor game of the 19th century intellectual was actually debating whether Russia was a Western European or non-Western Asian society. And this question is particularly fascinating because it was unanswerable. To this day, Russia differs from the West in some fundamental ways, though its history has paralleled that of the West in other aspects. To get started, we need to talk about some historical background of Russia up to this time. During the Middle Ages, the Greek Orthodox Church was significant in assimilating Scandinavian descendants of the Vikings with the Slavic peoples of Eastern Europe. However, in the 13th century, the Mongols from Asia will invade Eastern Europe and ruled the Eastern Slavs for over 2 centuries, or a 200-year period of time. This is going to set the stage for the rise of absolutism in Russia. The authoritarian Mongol rule, led by the Mongol Khan, will leave a legacy of ruthless leadership that would continue in Russia in future centuries. Eventually, the princes who had become adept at serving the Mongols were awarded the title of Great Prince. And these princes of Moscow who had served the Khan would begin to consolidate their own rule and replace Mongol power. Ivan I and Ivan III will be the most important of these, and we'll talk about them in a little bit. So Muscovy began to emerge as the most significant principality that formed the nucleus of what later became Russia. However, the Russian nobles or boyars and the free peasantry will make it difficult for the Muscovite rulers to strengthen the state, and we'll detail this challenge to absolutism as we move through our lecture. So Ivan III, or Ivan the Great, 1442 to 1505. In 1480, he will end the Mongol domination of Muscovy and establish himself as the hereditary ruler of Muscovy. This was in response to the fall of the Byzantine Empire and his desire to make Moscow the new center of the Orthodox Church, or the Third Rome. The Tsar became the head of the church, or rightful and holy ruler. The Second Rome, if you'll remember, had been Constantinople before it was conquered by the Ottoman Empire in 1453. Many Greek scholars, craftsmen, architects, and artists were brought then into Muscovy. The Tsar claimed his absolute power was derived from divine right as ruler, making him an autocrat. Ivan will struggle, however, with the Russian boyars, or the Russian nobles, for power. Eventually, however, the boyars' political influence will decrease, and they will help the Muscovite princes consolidate their power, but they began exerting more control of their peasants. Ivan the Fourth, or Ivan the Terrible, as he'll become known, from 1533 to 1585, is the grandson of Ivan III. He ascended to the throne at the age of 3. His mother had died at the age of 8, most likely poisoned. It is while he's being raised that he will encounter and suffer insults and neglect from the boyars or nobles. So if you see some commonality here with Louis XIV, that he had also gone through during the Fronde in France. At the age of 16, he will push aside his hated advisors, and in an awe-inspiring ceremony, complete with the pouring of gold coins down his head, he will crown himself to Tsar. He is the first to take the title of Tsar, which is a contraction of the word Caesar, or Caesar. He married a Romanov, whose name is Anastasia. The Romanov dynasty will follow for quite some time. We'll talk about another Romanov here in a little while, but we will, as we keep coming back to Russia, hit on the greatness of the Romanov family there. But he does marry a Romanov named Anastasia. Under Ivan the Terrible, there will be great territorial expansion. He will control the Black Sea region and gain huge territories in the Far East and gain territories in the Baltic region. He will also begin westernizing Muscovy, encourage trade with England and the Netherlands. For 25 years, however, he will fight unsuccessful wars against Poland and Lithuania. Military obligations deeply affected both nobles and peasants during this time, and these wars will leave much of Central Europe depopulated. The Cossacks, or peasants, will flee to the west to the newly conquered Muscovite territory in the east and form free groups and outlaw armies. The government will respond by increasing serfdom. Serfdom being, of course, that important element to Eastern European absolutism. This is going to reduce the power of the boyars by requiring that all nobles serve the Tsar in order to keep their lands. Serfdom will increase substantially to keep peasants tied to noble lands, and many nobles will actually be executed, which will create a new service nobility. Ivan had blamed the boyars for his wife's death and thus became increasingly cruel and demented. After his wife's death, Ivan will commit terrible atrocities, including the murder of his own son. However, that won't keep him from getting some correspondence on with the Virgin Queen, Elizabeth I of England. And even that we think that there was a consideration of an offering of hand in marriage here. So kind of sticking it to Philip II, who had also been interested in Elizabeth at the time. During this time period as well, however, merchants and artisans were also bound to their towns so that the Tsar could more efficiently tax them. The urban class will have no security in their work or property at this time. And this was a check on the growth of the middle class, which differs very much from Western Europe. The middle class growing exponentially in Western Europe, while the growth of the middle class is drastically checked in Eastern Europe. This contrasts also to the emergence of capitalism in Western Europe, where merchants gained influence and more security over private property. So some differences between Eastern European and Western European absolutism. After the death of Ivan and his successor, Russia will enter a chaotic period known as the Time of Troubles from 1598 to 1613. Ivan IV had died in 1584. This is going to be a period of famine, power struggles, and war. The Cossack bands will travel north, massacring nobles and officials. Sweden and Poland will conquer Moscow. In response, nobles are going to elect Ivan's grandnephew as the new hereditary czar and rally around him to drive out the invaders. So in 1613, the National Assembly will meet and elect a 17-year-old boy, Michael Romanov, as their czar. The Romanov dynasty is going to last from the ascent of Michael Romanov at age 17 in 1613 to the Russian Revolution in 1917. So this makes the Romanov the new hereditary czar. So Michael Romanov, although he successfully reconsolidated central authority, he did not really significantly improve the conditions of the common people. He supported or favored the nobles in return for their support. He reduced military obligations significantly for the nobles. He will expand Russian Empire to the Pacific Ocean and the Far East, and will fight several unsuccessful wars against Sweden, Poland, and the Ottoman Empire during his reign. Russian society will continue to transform in the 17th century. Nobles will gain more exemptions from military service. The rights of the peasants will decline. The bloody Cossack revolts resulted in further restrictions on serfs, and this was the bloodiest led revolt by the Cossack Steng Narazin. So we're seeing here again some of the differences between Eastern and Western absolutism. We have the nobility gaining strength and privilege and exemptions here in Eastern Europe, while our peasantry is significantly held down and peasant revolts. During this time of transformation, old believers of the Orthodox Church will resist influx of the new religious sects that are coming from the West, such as the Lutherans and the Calvinists. In protest, 20,000 of these old believers will burn themselves to death over 20 years. The old believers will be severely persecuted by the government. There is actually in Woodboro, Oregon, many Russian descendants of these old believers who settled in the area in the early 1950s. Western ideas, however, even with the old believers pushing back, are going to gain ground as Russian society transforms. Despite the turbulence of the period, several achievements were made during the second half of the 17th century. Western books were translated into Russian. New skills in technology, clothing, and customs, such as men trimming their beards, and the first Russian translation of the Bible began in 1649. By 1700, 20,000 Europeans lived in Russia. And by 1689, Russia was the world's largest country, 3 times the size of Europe. It was during this troubled time that a child was born who would become Peter the Great, 1672 to 1725. He will reign from 1682 to 1725. Peter's background. Peter the Great was born in Moscow in 1672, and like Louis XIV, he had faced revolts from various factions in his childhood, and his uncle was murdered in front of his eyes. Moscow to him will remain a forbidding medieval city. And so some of those complex similarities between Louis XIV and Peter the Great and the things that they experienced in their youth that they will bring to the table as they rule as absolute leaders. Peter the Great, however, will, on a side note, grow to be a large man, huge for the time, almost 7 feet. He was said to be so strong he could bend a horseshoe with his bare hands. His sister, Sophia, will rule as his and his half-brother's regent early on in his reign. However, she plotted to kill Peter, and it will fail, and he will have her banished to a monastery. His mother, Natalia, will then take over as his regent, and then Peter and his half-brother Ivan will begin ruling on their own right when Peter was 22. They will rule together from 1862 to 1696, and then Peter will rule independently for 36 years. Only one of these years of his reign, however, is going to be peaceful, and his reign starts right off with the revolt of the Strotsky, and he will defeat this military group or a group of Moscow guards that had overthrown previous leaders. This defeat of these guards is going to secure Peter's reign, and the security of his reign will now be intact. Military power was Peter's greatest concern. When we get down to the Great Northern War, and just a little bit, we talk about how the reforms in Peter's military campaign were formed as causes of the Great Northern War. But each Russian village would be given requirements to send recruits for the Russian army with 25-year enlistments. 75% of the national budget will be spent on the military by the end of Peter's reign. There will be a royal army of over 200,000 men, plus additional 100,000 special forces of Cossacks and foreigners. And he will establish royal military and artillery academies. All young male nobles were required to leave home and serve 5 years of compulsory education. This was actually one of Peter's least favorite reforms, but he'll find it a necessity as we talk about in the Great Northern War. He builds a large navy on the Baltic, though it will significantly decline after his death. And non-nobles will now have opportunities to rise up in the ranks of the military under Peter. And so what kind of sets all of this off is that in 1700 to 1721, there will be what is known as the Great Northern War. Peter had actually led a group of officials and nobles on a tour of Western European capitals, and while he was there, he had become particularly impressed with the growing power of the Dutch and the English and considered how Russia could profit from their example. So upon his return to Russia, Peter is going to enter into a secret alliance with Denmark and Poland to wage a sudden war of aggression against Sweden with the goal of securing access to the Baltic Sea and opportunities for westward expansion. Peter and his allies believed that their combined forces would win easy victories because Sweden was in the hands of a new and inexperienced king. And so it was Russia with Poland, Denmark, and Saxony as allies versus Sweden under Charles VII, our 18-year-old newbie king. However, the 18-year-old Charles VII of Sweden, who rules from 1697 to 1718, will surprise Peter and defeat Denmark quickly in 1700, then turn on Russia. In a blinding snowstorm, his well-trained professional army attacked and routed unsuspecting Russians besieging the Swedish fortress of Narva on the Baltic coast. Peter and the survivors will have to flee in panic to Moscow. And it was for the Russians a grim beginning to the long and brutal Great Northern War, which will last from 1700 to 1721. Peter's response to this defeat will be measures designed to increase state power, strengthen his armies, and gain victories. And this is where we get all of the military reforms that we talked about previously. So with the new schools and universities to produce skilled technicians and experts, the requirement of 5-year education away from home, military civilian bureaucracy with 14 ranks, as well as increased service requirements, bringing in talented foreigners, and establishing a regular standing army of more than 200,000. It's Peter's new war machine that will be able to crush the small army of Sweden and Ukraine at Poltava in 1709, one of the most significant battles in Russian history. Russia's victory against Sweden was conclusive, and in 1721, Estonia and present-day Latvia will come under Russian rule for the first time. The cost was high, however. Warfare will consume 80 to 85% of all revenues in Russia, but Russia will become the dominant power in the Baltic and very much a European great power. It is at this point that modernization and westernization will become Peter's major focuses. He had traveled to the West as a young man to study its technology and culture, and at that time that's where he picked up a lot of the military focuses he had, as military technology had been his primary concern. He imported to Russia substantial numbers of Western technicians and craftsmen to aid in the building of large factories. By the end of his reign, Russia will outproduce England in iron production, although Sweden and Germany will produce more. The industrial form of serfdom existed in factories where workers could be bought and sold. State will regulate monopolies and will echo the mercantilist policies of Western Europe. However, it will actually stifle economic growth, and industrial serfs will create inferior products. Government will become more efficient. The Tsar will rule by decree, an example of his absolute power, and the Tsar theoretically owned all land in the state, and nobles and peasants served the state. No representative political bodies, and all landowners owned lifetime service in the state, either in the military, civil service, or in court. In return, they gained greater control over their serfs. A table of ranks will set educational standards for civil servants, most of whom were nobles. Peter sought to replace old boyar nobility with new service-based nobility loyal to the Tsar. Russian secret police will ruthlessly and efficiently crush opponents of the state. And taxation will be very heavy on trade sales and rent, and there will be a head tax on every male. It will turn the Orthodox Church into a government department in 1700. St. Petersburg is going to be one of Peter's crowning achievements, but also one of his very westernized ideals. After his victory at Poltava, Peter will channel the enormous resources into building a new Western-style capital on the Baltic to rival the great cities of Europe. It had originally a desolate and swampy Swedish outpost. The magnificent city of St. Petersburg was designed to reflect modern urban planning, with wide, straight avenues, buildings set in uniform line, and large parks. He'd sought to create a city similar to Amsterdam and his palace, the Peterhof, with the grandeur of Versailles. Peter the Great dictated that all in society realize his vision. Just as the government drafted the peasants for the armies, so it drafted 25,000 to 40,000 men each summer to labor in St. Petersburg without pay. Many peasant construction workers died from hunger, sickness, and accidents, and nobles were ordered to build costly stone houses and palaces in St. Petersburg and to live in them for most of the year. Merchants and artisans were also commanded to settle and build in the new capital. These nobles and merchants were then required to pay for the city's infrastructure. The building of St. Petersburg was in truth an enormous direct tax levied on the wealthy, with the peasantry forced to do the manual labor. And just some visuals of St. Petersburg and Peterhof, which very much we talked about being based off of Versailles, down to the fountains and the gardens. Here, your ornate interior, grandeur, the Baroque style. St. Petersburg. Okay. So Peter's reforms modernized Russia and brought it closer to the European mainstream, a more modern military and a state bureaucracy, emerging concept of interest in the state as separate from the Tsar's interest, and the Tsar began issuing explanations to his degrees to gain popular support. Peter the Great remains a towering figure in European history, but it would be his granddaughter-in-law who would continue to westernize Russia, and we will get to her as we continue to move through history, Miss Catherine the Great.